one of the big causes of hypertension.
Honey, you're okay on those first two I love hymns.
The man who created Good Times grew up in Cabrini Green, one of the most dangerous housing projects in American history. He dropped out of high school, hitchhiked to Hollywood with no connections, no money, and no plan, and told himself he was going to put black heroes on television. He did exactly that. And then Hollywood destroyed him for it. Good Times premiered on CBS on February 8, 1974. It was the first primetime sitcom in American television history to center on a two-parent black family. For 6 seasons, it tackled unemployment, gang violence, drug addiction, evictions, and discrimination, inside a genre that most networks still used for light, consequence-free entertainment. It made Jimmy Walker a household name. It gave Janet Jackson her first acting role, and it generated battles behind the scenes so real, so full of genuine conviction, that the show nearly collapsed under the weight of its own importance. 15 facts today. Some will make you rethink how this show got made. One involves a fight that changed the face of black television forever, and the woman who won it. And the one we close on answers the question that haunts the show's entire legacy. Did Good Times help Black America, or did it let the system off the hook? Let's count it down.
Don't mind. Because too much of that can be fattening too.
15. The show was born in a Chicago housing project. Before there was a TV show, before there was a script, before there was a network deal, there was a kid named Kenneth Williams growing up in Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green was a public housing development on the near north side of Chicago, overcrowded, underfunded, and increasingly controlled by gangs as city services and economic opportunities withdrew. It was the kind of place that American television in the early 1970s had never depicted honestly, partly because the people making American television had never lived anywhere near it. Kenneth Williams grew up there. He later adopted the name Eric Monte. He dropped out of high school. He hitchhiked to Los Angeles with the belief, which his own mother told him was delusional, that he was going to become a writer in Hollywood. He made it. He collaborated with Mike Evans, an actor who played Lionel Jefferson on All in the Family, to develop the pilot script. Together, they pitched the concept to Norman Lear, then the most commercially successful comedy producer in American television. When Monty sat down to write The Evans Family, Florida and James, their children JJ, Thelma, and Michael, living in apartment 17C in a Chicago housing project, he was not writing from research, he was writing from memory. That authenticity was the foundation everything else was built on. And it started in Cabrini Green.
You can do it. Yeah, that's my baby. Oh, I missed out. What's the...
14. Esther Roll won the fight that defined the show's entire meaning. This is the most important creative decision in the history of Good Times, and it was made not by a producer or a network executive, but by an actress who drew a line and refused to move it. When Norman Lear decided to develop Good Times, he had a specific vision. Florida Evans would be the central character, the children would be present, and there would be no father. Esther Roll, who had been playing Florida as a housekeeper on Lear's show Maude, was offered the starring role. She wanted it, and she refused to take it on Lear's terms. "I couldn't compound the lie that black fathers don't care about their children," Rolle later explained. She would not be part of a show that presented another fatherless black household as the default. She had seen that narrative embedded in American television for too long. A show claiming to depict black family life with honesty, that opened by removing the father, was not honest. It was a different version of the same old stereotype, dressed up in progressive clothing. Lear agreed to include James Evans. He hired John Amos, an actor who had appeared occasionally on Maude as Florida's husband under the name Henry, and recast the character as James. The two-parent family at the center of Good Times became the very thing that distinguished the show from everything surrounding it on the dial.
Well, let's see what all the equal opportunity employers have for James Evans this morning.
Think about what Rolle was actually doing in that negotiation. She was not simply advocating for a personal preference. She was doing something far more specific. She was refusing to allow a show that presented itself as honest about black family life to embed, at its foundation, the most damaging stereotype about black fathers, that American. Popular culture had been circulating for decades. She understood that the first impression the show made would shape every conversation it had with its audience for as long as it ran. Esther Rolle drew the line, and that decision changed what the show was able to mean for millions of Black viewers who turned it on every week and saw something they had never quite seen before. Tarin. The show was a spin-off of a spin-off and erased its own history. Good Times has one of the most tangled genealogies in American sitcom history, and understanding it changes how you see the show's place in the Norman Lear universe. All in the Family premiered in 1971 and became a massive CBS hit. Lear spun it off into Maude in 1972, starring Bea Arthur as a wealthy liberal woman who needed a housekeeper. That housekeeper was Florida Evans, played by Esther Roll. Florida became a fan favorite, a grounded, dignified presence in an otherwise chaotic household, and Lear recognized the potential.
That's what we're supposed to be arguing about in the first place. How did we get off on egg yolks?
He spun her off again into Good Times in 1974. But Good Times never acknowledged where Florida came from. There is no mention of Maude, no mention of the wealthy Connecticut household where Florida had worked. The writers simply wrote a new history for the character and moved on. In Maude, Florida's husband was named Henry. In Good Times, his name is James. The continuity doesn't hold up. It wasn't meant to. The show wanted its own identity, not as a spin-off of a show about an affluent white woman, but as its own story standing on its own foundation. And by erasing that history, it became something more powerful, a self-contained world where the Evans family answered to nobody's context but their own. No wealthy employer, no Connecticut, just Chicago and an apartment and a family figuring out how to survive. In real life, erasure is usually a loss. In this case, it was how the show became what it needed to be. 12, the real creator, grew up in the projects he wrote about, and Hollywood left him homeless. Eric Monte's story is one of the most painful in the history of American television. Monte grew up in Cabrini Green, wrote the Good Times pilot from that experience, and for a brief moment in the early 1970s was one of the hottest young writers in Hollywood. He also wrote What's Happening, based on his semi-autobiographical film Cooley High. In 1977, Monte filed a lawsuit against CBS, ABC, Norman Lear, and others, alleging that his ideas for Good Times, The Jeffersons, and What's Happening had been taken without proper credit or compensation. The lawsuit eventually settled. Monte received a $1 million settlement and a small percentage of Good Times residuals. The settlement had obvious validity. The other side paid, but what followed was devastating. Hollywood blacklisted him. The offer stopped. He had won his legal battle and lost his career simultaneously. At the peak of his success, he had owned a home in Santa Monica and driven a Mercedes. By 2006, he was living in a Salvation Army shelter in Bell, California, in recovery from addiction. The man who had written the Evans family's cramped apartment from memory was sleeping in a shelter. He later returned to Chicago, maintained his sobriety, and continued trying to write. The show he created from his own childhood generated millions in cultural impact. He received a fraction of what he was owed. His story sits beneath the credits of every episode like something the industry would prefer not to see.
Filed a suit against ABC, CBS, Salt Turtle Tire, Bernie Ornstein.
11. Norman Lear hated the catchphrase that made the show famous. Dynamite, 3 syllables, 1 performance. One of the most recognized catchphrases in television history. Jimmy Walker's delivery became the show's most commercially recognizable element. Splashed across merchandise, quoted in schoolyards, embedded in the permanent vocabulary of the 1970s. Walker became one of the most famous faces on American television. His image was everywhere. Norman Lear reportedly hated every second of it. Walker shared at a 2014 Television Critics Association panel that Lear was so opposed to the catchphrase that it literally made him throw up. Lear was a character-driven producer who believed television's job was to say something real. He had built his reputation on All in the Family, comedy as a vehicle for confronting racism, class resentment, and the specific ugliness of American prejudice. He believed deeply that entertainment could carry a moral argument. Dynamite was the opposite of that. It was pure, context-free entertainment, a catchphrase that worked because of Walker's timing and physical commitment, not because it illuminated anything about the Evans family's actual situation or the realities of life in a Chicago housing project. As JJ's antics became the dominant draw week after week, the show's creative center shifted away from James and Florida's serious engagement with poverty and towards something broader, lighter, and considerably less challenging. Lear saw it coming. He said so, and he couldn't stop it. The catchphrase made Jimmy Walker famous. It also began the slow erosion of the show's original purpose. The gap between the show Good Times was supposed to be and the show it was becoming widening a little more with every dynamite the audience applauded. If this kind of real history, the fights behind the shows, the people left behind, the decisions that defined American television, is what you want more of, subscribe. This is exactly what we do every week.
Relevant. Are you jiving? Sweet Daddy Williams owns 3 apartment houses.
10. John Amos was fired for caring too much about authenticity. The departure of John Amos at the end of season 3 is one of the most consequential exits in 1970s television, and the reason reveals something painful about the gap between what the show promised and what the production was willing to deliver. Amos had fundamental disagreements with the writing staff, none of whom were black, about how James Evans should be portrayed. His argument was specific. The writers were writing a black father as they imagined one, rather than as one actually was. I felt like I knew more about what a black family should be and how a black father would act than our writers, Amos said in a 2020 interview. Their perception of what a black family would be and a black father would be was totally different from mine. He pushed. He had emotional discussions with Lear. The writing staff became more receptive for a period, but the tension persisted. And by the end of season 3, Amos was told his contract would not be renewed. In television, that means fired. The production's solution was final. James Evans was killed off in a car accident in Mississippi, just as the family seemed on the verge of escaping the projects. He never came home. The show that had insisted on having a father killed that father because the man playing him cared too much about getting him right.
It sure would have been nice.
9. Florida's grief scene shocked the country and was almost cut. When the season 4 premiere aired in 1976, Esther Roll performed a scene that stopped American television cold. Florida Evans learns her husband has been killed. She goes still. Then she smashes a punch bowl against the wall. She grabs at things. She speaks her grief in fragments. The way grief actually arrives, not in clean narrative, but in broken phrases and body memory. The way the body processes what the mind can't yet hold. Then she says, "Damn, damn, damn," 3 times. With that specific force, by an actress who had fought for the right to have this husband in the first place, and who was now in front of a live studio audience with cameras rolling, processing his removal in real time. In 1976, on a CBS sitcom, it hit audiences like something they hadn't been prepared for. The CBS switchboard lit up. Fan response was divided between people who were genuinely shaken by the scene's raw honesty and people who objected to the language in a comedy context. Some producers had wanted something softer, more contained, less demanding, a cleaner exit, something that would let the audience off the hook a little. Roll performed the scene as she believed it needed to be performed. She gave it everything. It aired. It became television history. 3 words that millions of viewers needed to hear at exactly that volume of truth.
Gee, gorgeous hunk of woman here.
8. Esther Roll left the show and took its soul with her.
What you mean soon?
Thelma, now I told you your daddy had a hard day and he don't want to hear nothing about it.
By season 5, the tensions had reached a breaking point. The show's focus had shifted toward comedy. The social purpose that had justified the show in Roll's mind was, she felt, no longer its primary concern. She left after season 5, citing salary disputes the production refused to address. Florida Evans was written out, dispatched to Arizona with a new husband while the children stayed in Chicago. The result was a weaker show by almost every critical measure. Without Rolle's gravity as the moral anchor, episodes leaned harder on JJ's comedy and struggled to find the emotional center the first 3 seasons had located so consistently. For season 6, she came back. The producers met her terms. Florida returned newly widowed, and the final season restored some of the show's original dynamic. She left because she wouldn't accept less than the show deserved. She came back for the same reason. The show's quality, in both directions, followed her right out the door and back in again. 7. The cast didn't actually like each other.
I'm a woman, so just take my word for it. Just because a woman is cranky doesn't mean she has menopause.
Here is a detail that cuts directly against the warmth appearing on screen every week. Jimmy Walker has been remarkably candid in interviews about life off camera. By his account, the cast had almost no relationship outside the production. They didn't socialize. They didn't confide in each other. They showed up, taped the show, and went their separate ways. Walker has said he did not have Esther Rolla's or John Amos's phone numbers during production. He described his off-camera relationship with Rolle as essentially non-existent. He hung out with Bernadette Stanis, Thelma, on at most one occasion she could recall. With Janet Jackson, he said simply that he doesn't talk to kids. The Evans family, who projected warmth and cohesion onto millions of screens for 6 seasons, were behind the camera a group of talented professionals fulfilling their obligations and going home separately. No shared meals, no maintained friendships. The intimacy you saw on screen was entirely constructed within the frame. There is something specifically ironic about this. Good Times was a show about family as survival, about people holding together because the alternative is not surviving at all. The fictional family that moved so many viewers was performed by a cast that barely knew each other. The warmth was real in the only space that mattered. But it was also entirely manufactured. That's the specific craft of acting, of course. But knowing it somehow deepens rather than diminishes what the cast actually achieved. They built something genuine out of nothing personal. That's harder than it looks. 6. Janet Jackson's first professional role was on this show.
Hold it now. First, we've got to take off your sweater.
Don't go away, JJ.
Before Nasty, before Control, before 30 years of one of the most influential music careers in history. Janet Jackson's first professional acting role was on Good Times. She joined the cast in season 5 as Penny Gordon Woods, a young girl in the Evans building who is being severely abused by her mother. The storylines were, by 1977 network sitcom standards, genuinely harrowing. Child abuse was not standard primetime fare. The show put it on screen and asked its audience to stay with the discomfort. Jackson was around 10 years old. She was already part of the Jackson family entertainment world, but this was her first scripted dramatic role. Walker barely interacted with her on set, partly by his own admission, partly because her character's emotional register was entirely separate from the JJ comedy scenes. In 1979, she left for different strokes. The music career followed. But it all started in apartment 17C, A Little Girl in Trouble, played by the youngest Jackson, on a show that had never been afraid to look at what trouble actually looked like. 5. The show tackled topics that other sitcoms wouldn't touch.
James, calm down. Stop upsetting yourself.
Now, Floyd, I ain't gonna say this no more.
Across 133 episodes, Good Times covered territory most American television in the 1970s was actively avoiding. Gang warfare, drug addiction and overdose, sickle cell anemia, eviction, racism in the school system, police brutality. The specific economics of poverty, not as background color, but as the operational reality shaping every decision the Evans family made. What it meant to work as hard as James Evans worked and still find the rent impossible to meet. What it meant to watch your children's futures constrained by systems you couldn't control. The show depicted rent parties, neighbors pooling money to help a family avoid eviction, at a time when most network television had never acknowledged that such a thing existed. This was not typical CBS comedy material in 1974. The network accepted it because the ratings were strong and because Norman Lear's track record gave him leverage other producers didn't have. But the acceptance was never unconditional. Some episodes went through significant network note processes before they could air, the production negotiating constantly for the right to say what it knew needed to be said. What made the show's handling work, when it worked, was that every serious subject was embedded in a family the audience already loved. An episode about sickle cell anemia wasn't a public service announcement. It was about Florida and James and their specific children, in their specific apartment, processing a specific fear. The issue was given a human address. That methodology, treating hard subjects as things that happen to people you care about rather than problems you observe from a safe distance, is something the best social issue television has always understood. Good Times understood it from the beginning. 4. The show was set in Cabrini Green but never said so.
Well, Lord have mercy. They sure do say that.
Apartment 17, 963 North Gilbert Avenue, a high-rise housing project on the north side of Chicago. Those are the show's stated coordinates. Any viewer with knowledge of Chicago's public housing geography would have immediately recognized Cabrini Green. The exterior shots in the opening and closing credits were unmistakable. The same towers, the same surrounding landscape, the same visual grammar that news cameras used when covering the development's escalating violence throughout the 1970s. The show was set there in everything but name. The decision was deliberate, partly legal caution, partly a recognition that by not naming Cabrini Green specifically, the Evans family's experience could belong to every housing project in America, not just one. Viewers in Detroit and Atlanta and Los Angeles and Cleveland could see their own neighborhoods in the frame without the show having to film there. Name the specific place, and you localize the problem. Suggest it while keeping it unnamed, and you universalize it. Eric Monti, who grew up there and wrote The Family from that experience, understood this instinctively. The housing project wasn't exotic background to be observed from outside. It was home, familiar, interior, and by making it feel that way, specific in its textures, its pressures, its small economies, its particular social ecosystem, he made it possible for audiences who had never been anywhere near public housing to understand it from the inside. That is the difference between a show about poverty and a show that lives inside it. Good Times lived inside it because its creator did. 3. Jimmy Walker became famous for a character. Both lit actors despised.
Norma, you keep saving for the fro here. And JJ, you put the painting back, son. And boy,
Both Esther Roll and John Amos had serious objections to JJ's trajectory. Their concern was not personal. Walker was a talented comedian with genuine instincts. Their objection was about what JJ represented when he became the dominant focus, and what that dominance communicated to the millions of black viewers watching. Amos articulated it clearly. He felt JJ's broad, buffoonish comedy was a form of minstrelsy, that it reduced a black character to slapstick in a way that confirmed rather than challenged the stereotypes the show had been created to dismantle. A show that began as a serious examination of black family dignity was, by its middle seasons, best known for a catchphrase and a comedian mugging for the camera. Roll was equally direct. She said publicly that JJ was a negative image of black youth, that his combination of clowning and lack of ambition contradicted everything the show's parents were supposed to represent. Walker has spoken about the objections with philosophical detachment. He was hired to do comedy. He did it, the audience responded. But the argument Rowley and Amos were making wasn't about Jimmy Walker. It was about what American television was allowed to celebrate when a black character was on screen. That fight was never resolved, which is exactly why it still matters. 2. The show proved its own point, then ignored it.
now if anybody here knows another way I can raise the rent by 5 o'clock, I'll lay this up.
Good Times premiered as the first primetime sitcom to center on a two-parent black family, a deliberate, hard-won choice secured by Esther Roll's refusal to do the show any other way. And then, within 3 seasons, the show removed the father. The show that had proved American audiences would embrace a two-parent black family voluntarily undid that proof. The show groundbreaking for having James Evans became a show about a single mother navigating poverty, exactly the default narrative it had been created to challenge. Viewer mail after James's death expressed genuine grief, not for an actor's departure, but for a character, which tells you exactly how real the Evans family had become. The loss registered as a community loss. The tragic irony is that, by removing James Evans, the show proved Esther Roll's original argument more powerfully than any episode had. The family felt diminished. The specific thing that had made Good Times historically significant, two parents, together, under pressure, choosing each other and their children anyway, was the thing the production surrendered when it became inconvenient. Good Times showed America what was possible, and then gave it back. 1. What Good Times was actually saying, and why it still matters.
Hey, Thelma, how you like this? What is it? Don't show your ignorance.
Good Times was arguing something specific, week after week from 1974 onward. It was arguing that the lives of poor black families in public housing were worth the same narrative dignity as any other family in America. that Florida and James Evans's love for each other and their children was as worthy of a prime-time audience as any love story happening in the suburbs, that the pressures these families lived under were not shameful, not exotic, and not invisible, that the human beings inside those apartments were not case studies. They were people. This sounds obvious now. It was not obvious in 1974. The Jeffersons arrived in 1975 to show Black upward mobility, the story of getting out and getting ahead. Roots came in 1977 to show Black history in its full horror and dignity. The Cosby Show followed in 1984 to show Black professional life at its most aspirational. Each of those shows mattered. Each told a true story. But Good Times was the show that said, before any of that, before the mobility and the history and the aspiration, you have to see this family right here, in this apartment, in these circumstances, not going anywhere yet, not yet arrived, just here, fully human. Eric Monti wrote it from the inside because he had lived it. Esther Roll insisted the father had to be there because she understood what his absence would say. John Amos fought for the character's dignity because he knew that dignity was the whole point. Norman Lear gave them the platform and, to his credit, mostly let them use it. The fights that followed were real, and many left wounds that didn't fully heal. But the show that emerged from all of that, imperfect, compromised.
Judy, how come you decided to paint this?
I don't know. All of a sudden, I just had...
Brilliantly performed, infuriating in its inconsistencies, changed what American television thought it was allowed to say about Black family life. It walked through a door that hadn't existed before Esther Rolle demanded it be opened. And the question it leaves behind is not comfortable. What do we owe the people who build us the stories we love? What happens when the system consumes the very people it profits from? What does it say about an industry that took a man's childhood, built an empire out of it, and left him sleeping on a park bench? Eric Monti grew up in Cabrini Green. He told that story. He told it honestly, from memory, because he wanted the world to see something it had been trained not to look at. And then the story left him behind. That's not the kind of thing you forget. That's the kind of thing you're supposed to do something about. 15 facts, 1 show, and a question worth taking seriously. Do you think television has actually gotten better at telling the stories of poor and working-class Black families? Or do we just have more sophisticated ways of doing the same old things? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe if this is the kind of history you want to keep following. We'll be here.